Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm continuing my series on editorial fatigue. And this is the second part within that on the parable of the talents in Matthew 25 and the parable of the minas in Luke 19. Now, on the face of it, prima facie, when you read these, they appear to be similar but distinct parables that Jesus told on different occasions. New Testament scholar Mark Goodacre says instead that Luke simply modified Matthew to try to make up a second and distinct parable and put it in Jesus' mouth, but that he did so very clumsily. Today I'm going to be dealing with some of the what we might call aesthetic arguments for this. So one of them is, of course, that 7 of the servants who are mentioned in Luke's parable, the parable in Luke, are not discussed any further. He says the nobleman gave a mina to each of 10 servants, but then we only get details about what happens with 3 of them. To Goodacre, this is just klutzy in the extreme. But is it really such a big deal to say 10 and then use only 3 to make your point? Is this something that Jesus just quote unquote wouldn't have done? I think that's a pretty subjective judgment. Jesus, like any good teacher, can decide what to do on the fly. He can introduce the idea that there were 10 servants and they each got 1 mina according to their ability, but then decide as he goes, I'm only going to do 3 of those, similar to what I, might do elsewhere. In fact, probably the Matthean parable took place later. But the point is, Jesus is not necessarily making some kind of blunder just because he mentions 10 and then only details 3. I just don't see a problem with that for Jesus, and I don't think we need to try to give it some really heavy meaning either, because we'd just be guessing. I will say that he is here talking about each one getting the same amount of money. That may be an interesting difference, whereas in the Matthean parable it explicitly said they're given different initial amounts in accordance with their ability. So here they all start out the same, but they do different things, and he decides to go into detail with that on 3. To me, no problem. Not a good argument that this is Luke's creation rather than Jesus' creation. Now, Goodacre pushes a little bit more here on the Greek of a certain word. And I want to use this a bit as an illustration of how even when an argument is using a specific linguistic point, ultimately it's going to come down to your evaluation of the force of that point, and being a big expert in the language, or not a big expert, or not an expert at all, or maybe not even reading the language. And I do not, in fact, just sit down and read Greek. That doesn't mean I don't know anything about Greek, but I don't read Greek. Is it really what's at issue? And I think you'll see this as I go on. When Luke gives the fate of the 3 servants, he says the first, the second, and the other. And for the other, he uses an article, the other, okay? Now, Goodacre makes a big deal about this. He uses the word amazing. Amazingly, the other. So Luke is just thinking of 3 servants. Now, actually, as he admits, even the Q project translates this as another. So it's not like if you know Greek, you're automatically going to translate it as the other. But suppose you do think it should be translated the other, the first, the second, and the other. By the time that 3rd servant is being discussed, the teller of the story knows, presumably, that this is the only other one he's going to actually discuss. So think about this. If Jesus really told this story, he gives what happened with the first servant. He gives what happened with the second servant. By the time he gets he's going to tell you what happened with the third servant. I think he's definitely decided, I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to go on through fourth, the fifth, the sixth, etc. So to say the other is completely appropriate. The other that I'm going to talk about. Or, possibly this story was something, I think even plausibly, that Luke got from someone who was present, a human source, rather than a written source. I think that's very plausible. So Luke knows by that time, as he's recounting what was recounted to him, that there are in fact only going to be 3. It's not like you tell about the third one, and only after you're finished telling about how the third one was judged by his Lord, then you go, no, I guess I'm not going to do a fourth one. Like, the decision's already been made by that time. So the other is not a strong argument that this is a result of some kind of fatigue, where Luke is just sort of falling into this because he's fallen back into copying Matthew. There's another, to my mind, very strong argument against the claim that this is an evidence of editorial fatigue. Now remember, Goodacre uses the phrase docile reproduction to describe editorial fatigue, and he often is referring to exact language. All right, so when the exact language of the gospel he regards as derivative and as just changing the facts in some way, but then falling into copying the source, when the exact language is the same, he always makes a big deal about it. So, for example, if the author that's derivative starts by calling Herod the Tetrarch and later calls Herod the King, and is supposedly getting it from Mark, and Mark calls Herod the King in both places, it's like, see, he fell back into docilely reproducing Mark. But here, it can only be docile reproduction in a somewhat conceptual and metaphoric sense. Matthew doesn't say the first, the second, and the other. The exact language that is supposedly evidence of Luke's docile reproduction isn't found in his alleged source. Instead, Matthew does the one who, all right? Because remember, Matthew, in the parable of the talents, the people have been given different amounts. So it's, the one who was given this many talents came, and the one who was given this many talents came, and the one who was given 1 talent came, and then this is what happened, okay? So he never does the other. And yet this is supposed to be such strong evidence that Luke is just he's sort of fallen into docilely copying Matthew. So we have to add another epicycle. This other layer of ad hocness is that Luke falls into docile reproduction, but is not really all that docile. He's somewhat using his own language, but he's falling into docilely reproducing Matthew's ideas, but still telling it with his own language, but he's sort of fatigued and is falling into dealing with only 3 servants because he's clumsily trying to tell Matthew's story as if it's a new story, as if it's a different story. Very implausible theory. All right. Now we come to the bad math argument. Those who reject fact changing by the gospel authors are often criticized as being wooden literalists. You will hear this so often. But there ain't no wooden literalist like a redactive critic. They are often the most wooden of wooden. So in this case, I mentioned this last time, but I'll say it again. The bad math argument goes like this. When it comes to the unprofitable servant, the nobleman says, take the mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10. And then the other servants object and they say, but he has 10. Aha! But since it said that profitable servant told the master, your mina has made 10 more, then that's really a total of 11. So he should have said, take it away from him and give it to the one who has 11. Now, there have been translational arguments about this. Did it really mean originally he made 10 more in addition to the 1, or he increased the 1 to 10? But let us even suppose that Luke's audience would have heard it, and since I think Jesus actually told it, Jesus' audience would have heard it as, your mina has made 10 more. So technically this guy has 11. Is it really a problem that when the nobleman speaks, he says, give it to the one who has 10, and uses a what we might call round number, okay? Not who has exactly 10 and no more than 10. I mean, if he has 11, he has 10, right? And that similarly, what was salient, we're picturing, it's a story, right? It's just a story Jesus is telling. What we're picturing the other servants as having clear before their mind is, he has 10, like it's the larger amount of profit that he has just reported to his master, the nobleman, upon his return. It's very wooden to say that there's some problem here. If Jesus told the story, we don't want to attribute a math mistake to Jesus, so we say Luke made up this whole parable out of whole cloth and put it in Jesus' mouth because Jesus wouldn't have made a math mistake. I just really think that's a very, very poor argument. It doesn't have to be a math mistake. It can just be envisaging the people in the story as speaking of that larger noticeable amount, which is the amount of profit that servant made. And then one more argument that Goodacre gives, and I believe he might get this from Golder, but I don't recall if he does, but he definitely makes it his own. The nobleman in this parable, just similar to in the parable of the talents, tells them to take away the amount of money that the unprofitable servant has and to give it to the servant who was the most profitable. Now that servant has just been made ruler over 10 cities because each one is made, ruler over the number of cities corresponding to the profit that they have made. And so Goodacre says, like a mina isn't very much money by this time. He's made 10 more and he's a ruler over 10 cities. It's like giving him a tip, like it's not going to make some big difference, some big deal to the most profitable servant to receive a mina. Again, I think this is a very poor, very subjective argument because really the point is it's being taken away from the unprofitable servant. Also, I suppose we can imagine that it's sort of implied that the most profitable servant is also going to get another city, to match it. But I don't know if that's true. Certainly, Jesus doesn't say that, but that's not the point. It's that the one who is unprofitable will have, even what he was given the opportunity to use, taken away from him. And that later praise and responsibility is given in proportion to how profitable you have been for your master. Again, let's not be wooden literalists and say, well, we're having trouble making a really strong, religious theological point out of giving a single mina to that guy who already is ruler over 10 cities because it wouldn't be that big of an amount of money. I think, again, this is judging the parable in a implausible fashion. Okay, that's all I have to say about these two parables. And I would again emphasize that this turns upon judgment calls about what is ugly, or what Jesus wouldn't do, or what is super awkward and bumbling and that kind of thing. So that we have to attribute it to the bumbling attempt of Luke to write a new parable rather than to Jesus the storyteller. I would suggest that you think about that because that happens more often than you might think in arguments where things like a Greek article come up. You might think it turns on something that you can't possibly follow or that you can't possibly understand. Next time, I think I'm going to be talking about the death of John the Baptist and the claim that Matthew has changed some of the facts surrounding the death of John the Baptist in copying from Mark. So that will be an editorial fatigue argument concerning supposed editorial fatigue from Matthew, copying from Mark. We'll just continue this series because I really want to, in a sense, empower laymen to see that they can judge these things for themselves. That's the information we're giving here on the Lydia McGrew channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.